Okay, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Thank you for being here with us today. This is the first webinar of the season, and it will deal with a very important and modern issue that is climate change and how this change affects mental health. This is a very important issue, of course. We know very little concerning the interplay between weather and mental health, what Alex will describe as geopsychiatry later. So I will ask Albert Persaud, the chair of the World Psychiatric Association Initiative for Mental Health and Climate Change, to make some introductory remarks. Albert.
Thank you very much, Kostas, for that kind introduction, and welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. We welcome you to this geopsychiatry event. This is one of many events we'll be running. Just a short spiel about geopsychiatry. We are a group of people who are very interested and concerned about geopolitical events and its interface to mental health and mental illness. And as thus, we've embarked in this new initiative, not just to catalogue geopolitical events around the world, but try and do something about it. And I hope by the end of this session, you will come on board with us to help face this challenge. What we try to do is undertake our work through research, policy, and enabling better clinical practice or practices, so that we are able to respond to the modern challenges we face today, whether it's climate change, conflict. I mean, as we speak now, there is about 114 armed conflict in the world. 85% of the world lives in 153 low and middle income countries, and 80% of the people with a mental disorder live in low and middle income countries. So our focus is on that. Our focus is on financing how mental health can be better financed, from 25 cents to $2 across the world, and see if we can make a breakthrough with that through our political contacts and various other contacts. So I'm delighted now to hand back to Kostas. So we'll have our first speaker who will give you a roller coaster ride as to what is geopsychiatry, its origins, and where we go.
Let's first allow Afzal Zaved, the immediate ex-chair of the World Psychiatric Association, to say a few words.
Thank you, Kostas, and thank you, Albert, for setting the scene. I just want to thank Professor Dinesh Bogra in particular, apart from Alex, who both of them are speakers. But this was really one of the brainchilds of Professor Dinesh Bogra and Albert Persaud, when during the last triennium of WPA, we agreed that we should work on this particular topic and area. And keeping that in mind, when our WPA's General Assembly took place last year in Vienna, we approved this group as a special interest group of WPA on geopsychiatry. I think as time is passing on, we are getting more insight about this particular topic. And this group, which is led by Albert Persaud, and all of us are members of that, we are trying to sensitize people about this important issue of climate change and mental health. And on these grounds, we are grateful to both the speakers who have agreed to be the presenters for this evening. I'm sure their contribution will help all of us not only to be sensitized about this topic, but to start thinking seriously that how mental health professionals should look, perceive, and view climate change and the geopolitical situations within the perspectives of the mental health. Thank you very much, Kostas. Once again, over to you.
So let's proceed with our first speaker, who is Alex Smith, researcher at the Department of Forensic Psychiatry in the University of Bern, member of the Geopsychiatry Special Interest Group of the World Psychiatric Association. He has worked previously nearly a decade in academic journals publishing. He joined the University of Bern in 2022. His research interests center around geopolitical determinants of health, human rights, social justice, and how medicine intersects with the humanities. Some of his work has been featured in journals like The Lancet Psychiatry, European Psychiatry, Nature Mental Health, and others. Alongside his research positions, he is currently completing a PhD at the University of Bern, focusing on the mental health of politicians and geopolitical stressors. So, Alex, the floor is yours. We're all ears.
Thanks very much, Kostas. Appreciate that. So thanks very much to Albert, Afzal, and Kostas, and the wider organising team for their introductions, and also for inviting me to participate in this exciting webinar. So as mentioned, I'm a researcher in the Department of Forensic Psychiatry at the University of Bern, and I'll be giving you a presentation today on geopsychiatry, which is an emerging subdiscipline within psychiatry. And Albert kindly set me up for a fail by promising you all a roller coaster ride, which I will try my best to deliver on throughout this. So to set the scene, I'm giving this presentation 4 days from one of the most momentous and polarizing elections probably in the history of democracy, or at least in the history of modern democracy, where one candidate has already stepped down in part due to concerns about his mental health. And this election is taking place amidst many conflicts, amidst mass migratory trends, amidst advancements in artificial intelligence, and above all climate change, which is obviously relevant for the current discussion. And all of these, what I will refer to throughout the presentation as distal factors, distal geopolitical factors, you can call them macro factors, you can call them faraway factors, are all shaping the world and are all intrinsically linked on some level to mental health, be that at a populational level, at a community level, or at an individual level, as we shall discuss. And this, I think, really underlines a need for us to zoom out, hence geopsychiatry. And in psychiatric practice, which is natural as a clinical discipline, we can be quite focused on the here and now, individual patient by patient basis. And this is especially true in the discipline that I work in, forensic psychiatry, which has often been accused of being quite inward looking. Forensic psychiatrists work within one specific national jurisdiction, within one specific national legal framework. And which again often means that you don't purposely, or you don't have the time to look at what else is going on elsewhere and what is shaping contexts of practice at a local level. And these distal and macro, far away, however you want to describe them, factors are also shaping forensic psychiatry, as we will discuss in this presentation as well. So let's start with geopsychiatry. What is it? And this is a very challenging topic for me to describe, because the inventor of geopsychiatry was one of the first people to speak, Dr. Albert Perso. So I'll try to do you proud on this, Albert. But essentially, geopsychiatry emphasizes that there is a causal chain between distal, macro, faraway geopolitical factors and their impact on mental health at a local level. So the way I think of it is geopsychiatry is where distal meets local. It's an emerging discipline to which there is growing attention, as exemplified by the fact that the WPA has launched a special interest group dedicated to it. But I, above all, want to emphasize that it's not just a psychiatric discipline. So all of these distal challenges, conflict, migration, climate change, inevitably involve a wide range of disciplines. So geographers, policymakers, political scientists, legal scholars, and who should be involved in any conversation. So it's an interprofessional, interdisciplinary discipline that just so happens to be sat within the psychiatric discipline. so distal meets local, but I'll provide a couple of definitions from the literature, and there is a reference this at the end of this presentation as well. But the first one is here. So this is one of the seminal papers, one of the first few papers that was published on geopsychiatry, aside from obviously the work that Dr. Perso did. And it's by João Casteldelli Maia in Brazil and Dinesh Bugra, who is the second speaker following me. And it aims to define geopsychiatry. So geopsychiatry focuses on the influences and impact of global factors such as globalization, conflict, climate change, public health crises, disasters, migration, and the other factors that contribute to and affect the mental health, well-being individuals, their carers, and their families. So distal factors that are affecting local outcomes. And it's, as I say, the field has really taken off in the last few years. And this is demonstrated by the picture in the bottom left, which was several of us from the special interest group meeting the British ambassador to Switzerland. So policymakers and politicians are taking an interest in this, and the British ambassador to Switzerland is not the exception here. There's several policymakers and politicians around the world who are taking an active interest in this field. And then the picture on the right-hand side, which is kind of looking a bit dark on my slide, unfortunately, but this is a photo of the geopsychiatry special interest group who we were delighted to host at the University of Bern a few weeks ago, in front of a bench with Albert Einstein, who was one of the most famous people naturally associated with the University of Bern. So not just politicians, not just policymakers who are paying attention towards this field, but also funding bodies as well, because this symposium was funded by the Swiss National Science Foundation, which we were very grateful to receive that funding for. And then the second definition on this slide is written by me, and obviously, but it's basically just to introduce the notion of SDGs, which is the Sustainable Development Goal Agenda, which I will use throughout this presentation as a framework for discussing the interconnectedness between geopolitical factors and local factors in mental health. Okay, so hopefully everyone is familiar with this image in the top left, but it's the biopsychosocial model, which was developed by George Engel in the 1970s to become the predominant way that we look at disease and disorders. And it emphasizes the interplay between biological components of disease, psychological components of disease, and social components of disease, and how these, in our field in particular, relate to mental health. Geopsychiatry is intrinsically linked to this model, particularly the social determinant part, but also the psychological part and to a lesser extent the biological part. But the social part and the psychological part can all be informed by larger issues around the world. And I've stolen this image off Dr. Perso. I did get his permission before I did so. But this Rubik's Cube basically shows all of the nicely kind of represents a lot of the geopolitical issues that can affect mental health on a local level. So if you think conflict in the top right there, so conflict can obviously cause trauma, can cause disruptions to routines, it can cause socioeconomic like poverty, socioeconomic disadvantages. So that is intrinsically linked to social determinants plus the psychological determinants. Also, in Afghanistan, for example, the removal of education for females, obviously affecting gender equity and all kinds of issues like that, which would have an impact on socioeconomic status, social opportunities. Food scarcity obviously has very direct influence on socioeconomic status. And so all of these distal factors as examples here are related to the biopsychosocial model. It's just almost like we have to zoom out in terms of what we consider social. It can be local community, but also global as well. And the climate crisis is obviously a big issue that is affecting mental health, as we'll discuss later. The exact causal chain is kind of difficult to determine, but we'll come on to that later. So as I introduced, the Sustainable Development Goals is a framework that was developed by the United Nations and was signed up to and committed to by every member of the United Nations. And it basically articulates the goals, the areas that achievement is needed in across sustainable development by 2030. And there's various arguments about this in terms of it's the global north telling the global south what the priorities should be, which we won't go into, but it's attracted a lot of criticism. And there's various other frameworks I could have chosen, for example, the OECD, or there's ones from the WHO about indicators, but I've just chosen this as a framework to highlight the interconnectedness between geopolitical issues and mental health. Now, if you take a moment to read these 17 goals, and you think of the world that we live in right now, it probably won't surprise you to learn that only 15% of the targets within these goals are on track to be achieved by 2030. It's probably not a big surprise as you read these definitions. As an example, mental health is included in Goal 3, which contains relevant targets around suicidality, for example. However, still, mental disorders make up 13% of the global burden of disease. There's no evidence of a global reduction in this burden since 1990. There's 418 million disability-adjusted life years due to mental illness. I mean, just stop and think of that number, 418 million life years. And still, each year there's around 730,000 suicides recorded, and decreases are tracking below the target of reducing suicidality by a third. So it's not a pretty picture from that perspective. Now, if we return to this framework, so like I say, mental health is included in SDG 3, which is good health and well-being. If we go to another SDG, SDG 16, I think, again, you all know where I'm going with this. As of 2023, 59 armed conflicts recorded worldwide, active conflicts, more than any year since World War II. Around 25% of the global population lives in conflict-affected countries, so 1 in 4 of us live in conflict-affected countries. And this is tied to democracy receding around the world. So around 45% of the global population live in full or flawed democracies, as indicated by Democracy Index. And on the right-hand side, you can see a chart, a visual here that shows, like, in terms of high, turbulent, low, inactive conflicts that are taking place. But these are the current conflicts that were taking place as of July 2024. Obviously, conflict in Ukraine, conflict in the Middle East, Sudan, which we don't tend to hear about in the Western world so much, but record levels of hunger have been recorded in Sudan since that war broke out. So we're not doing so great on SDG 16 either. Now, SDG 16 and SDG 3 are intrinsically linked. Conflict and mental health, there's obvious links between the two of them. So based on WHO figures, more than 1 in 5 people exposed to conflict will develop a mental disorder, around half of which is severe. Obviously, exposure to combat and conflict can lead to PTSD, depression, anxiety, which has long-lasting effects, not just for individuals, but also their families. So these are distal issues, geopolitical issues that cause conflicts, but have very immediate adverse outcomes at a local level. Obviously, the scarcity of care in combat zones can make it very challenging to support people. And there's great work that goes on with mental health first aid and that kind of stuff, but it's just the reality of conflict zones prevent adequate care from reaching people. And of course, displacement and human rights violations can all take place during conflicts. And I think this was demonstrated at the beginning of the conflict in Ukraine, where 5 psychiatric hospitals were victim of shelling by Russian forces. So it's highly vulnerable people as well who are caught up in these conflicts. and they all tend to have geopolitical or at least political causes. All right, it's a bit depressing, this presentation, but okay, so if we return back to the Sustainable Development Goal framework, so again, we can see good health and well-being as the third one. Now, I've tried to select all of the ones that are relevant to migration, which the UN list, but it could be most of these issues here. But migration, obviously, driven by conflict, forced migration, driven by socioeconomic disparities, driven by climate change, driven by lack of opportunities, driven by exposure to violence, etc. Again, where are we up to on these things that drive the migration? So there's 281 million people living in a country that's different from their birth. So this includes forced and voluntary migration, which obviously aren't the perfect terms to describe individual situations and don't necessarily capture individual experiences, but I'll just use them as kind of blanket terms to describe the situation. But this is over 3 times the number that was estimated in 1970 for where we'd be at today. The global refugee population, perhaps unsurprisingly, because of the conflicts that are taking place around the world, increased by 7% last year. There's 43.4 million refugees across the world. Predominant countries are Afghanistan, Syria, Venezuela, and Ukraine. So conflict again having a big influence on migratory patterns. And estimate there's 68.3 million people who are internally displaced across the world. And these are all UN figures that are cited here. And those 68.3 million people, a significant proportion of those are involved in the conflict, caught up in the conflict in Sudan that's taking place at the moment. Again, so distal factors, geopolitical issues are driving migration. And again, migration has very local outcomes in terms of mental health. So migrants often face psychiatric risk factors at each stage of their migration. So pre-migration, exposures to trauma, economic hardship, transit, so physical danger, exploitation, uncertainty. And I think you can see that. I mean, my words don't do justice to the 2 pictures at the side here, but the one on the right-hand side is people who are trying to migrate to the United Kingdom on small boat crossings from northern France in Calais. And I think the image on the right-hand side, you can see of the people in life jackets, their small boat is deflated. And just a few days ago, there was a guy who died from a cardiac arrest after the small boat deflated, literally a few meters from taking off in Calais. And then the bottom image you can see here is from the war in Ukraine, so people fleeing the war in Ukraine. So these pre-migration and transit, trauma, physical danger, exploitation, uncertainty are all risk factors that you can encounter. And then arrival, so there's acculturation, culture shock, discrimination from the local population, legal hurdles, and then even post-arrival, isolation, long-term stress from integration, legal insecurity, and language barriers, lack of culturally sensitive services, if services even exist in the country that people have moved to. Obviously, financial and legal constraints, and all of these things can hinder access to mental health support. So again, it's geopolitical factors that are having an impact on forced migratory flows that then translate to mental health issues at a local level. And that's in terms of both risk factors, but also from a support perspective. When these people reach their destination, the chances of accessing mental health support can be quite low, can be quite difficult because of the barriers that are in the way. All right, so we return, and I'm not making any aspersions on the Sustainable Development Goals. I think a lot of these are laudable indicators, laudable aims to pursue, but it's just to show that all of these are interconnected with mental health, and that's geopsychiatry, distal meets local. So if we look at another example of a geopolitical issue, of a distal issue, which is climate change, which is obviously very relevant to this presentation. SDGs related to climate change, so SDG 6, clean water, sanitation, affordable and clean energy, climate action, life below water, life below land, responsible consumption and production. Could have also included sustainable cities and communities in there. And again, it won't surprise you to know that we are not doing very well on climate change either. So 2023 was the hottest year on record, 0.6 degrees warmer than the previous decades before that, and 1.48 degree warmer than 1850 to 1900 pre-industrial level. 28%, around 28% of life on Earth is threatened with extinction currently. So that's biodiversity. It's not just temperature, but biodiversity. And then fossil fuel CO2 emissions increased 1% globally in 2022. And this is a political decision. This is driven by economic interests. It's driven by a lack of policy on move to renewable energy, and all kinds of other factors. But in part, it's a political decision and it's an economic decision. So even with all of these COP, for example, and all these other climate initiatives, including the SDGs that are taking place around the world, fossil fuel emissions are still increasing. Okay, so I wanted to share this picture. And presently, I mean, news stories today about the flooding going on in Spain, but I've selected a few pictures here that kind of, again, demonstrate what's taking place around the world. So this was during COP26, and this is the foreign minister of Tuvalu, which is an island in the South Pacific. And he basically gave a speech while knee-deep in the Pacific. So this is part of the island that's been lost to climate change. And it's not just, obviously, these islands in the South Pacific, but Dr. Passau would obviously talk long about the effects that this is having in the Caribbean, small island nations, is rising sea levels. Then we look at this. So this was 2022 in China. So this is the worst ever heat wave that was recorded. So soaring temperatures led to droughts, wildfires, crop failures. And then here is the country's largest freshwater lake, which has just completely dried out as a result of this heat wave. And then the final thing, which if it wasn't so misty outside of my window right now, I would actually be able to see the mountain where this is on. So this is a picture of the glacier that's behind Jungfrau in the Bernese Oberland, so the Bernese Alps. And this was two tourists who visited on the right-hand side in 2009. And this is a glacier. And then on the left-hand side in 2024, so 15 years later. And you can see what's happened exact same time of year. And this is just to emphasize that in Switzerland, which is one of the highest income countries in the world, with the highest standard of living in the world, climate change is massively affecting Switzerland as well. So communities who live in the Alps who are observing these effects. So climate change is not just limited to low income countries, it transcends borders, and there's vulnerabilities in different parts of the world for these distal factors. So climate change and mental health as an area of interest is really taking off. So this is from PubMed, and you can see since the year 2000, there's been a big upsurge in people who are investigating the intersections between climate and mental health. So there's 3 papers registered in PubMed in 2000 compared to 318 in 2024. So it's a 100 times increase, basically. And I would expect this to continue going up as people around the world recognize the effects of climate change more and start to investigate this issue more. But there's a hand, and it's at present, because although 300 papers this year and it is increasing, it's still a relatively small body of literature about climate change and mental health. And this means it's quite difficult to exactly pinpoint the causal pathways between climate change and mental health issues at a local level, but more is happening on that front. So there's two seminal papers that I've cited here, both are very recent systematic reviews. Like I say, there's a reference list at the end of at the end of this presentation, which both of these are included on. But this is the first one is a systematic review that was published in the Lancet that basically determined that increased temperature and temperature variability associated with increased cases of suicide and suicidal behaviour. But again, there's issues with causal pathways, with a lack of data. And so I would really encourage everyone on this webinar to please take this up as a mantle and start doing work on this, because it, as I say, it really isn't limited to low-income countries. The effects of climate change are observable all over the world, and we really need to develop a more robust body of evidence on this. And the second paper down here, again, a systematic review, was about basically the same thing. So increased vulnerability to negative health effects and mental illness from extreme heat. And this shows that individuals' mental illness experience, so vulnerable individuals, people who already have mental illness, experience worse morbidity and mortality outcomes compared to their counterparts. So again, I know I keep saying this, but a distal factor, climate change, that is having a very real impact at a local level for vulnerable individuals. Okay, and then there's a few more papers here. So climate change is also changing, to an extent, the way we think about psychiatry. And there's one example of that is that there's new symptom classifications that obviously aren't yet recognized in ICD-11 or the DSM. But an example of this is eco-anxiety. There's also solastalgia, which is related to the mourning for lost biodiversity. But the top one here, you can see, so Indigenous peoples, children and young people, and those connected to the natural world are most impacted by eco-anxiety. So it's the landscape around you is changing. There's two images at the side here. So the one on the right is a woman in India who is crying because her mango crop spoiled due to really heavy and abnormal rains that year. And then the image above that is in Australia, again, of drought. There's a systematic review again here that's showing about mental health outcomes, so depression and anxiety related to eco-anxiety, but also says about qualitative studies. And that's another thing that I would really like to highlight, is that we can have quantitative data that shows increased prevalence rates, increased adverse mental health outcomes, etc. But there's people around the world who are living with this, and they're seeing their environment change. And I would really like to emphasize the importance of qualitative studies within climate change and mental health research, because it's about storytelling as much as it is about data. And we need to provide some context to what's happening. And then the last one you can see is related to extreme and prolonged weather events. So not just heat, not just a loss of biodiversity, but it's also related to natural disasters and things like that. And I would, as I said at the start, it's not just limited to general psychiatry. It's not just related to general mental health. So climate change is having a very big impact in forensic mental health as well. So an image here is of Fyodor Dostoevsky, who was a Russian writer in the 19th century, who was imprisoned in a Tsarist labor camp for political crimes. But the reason I've put him up and done a strange segue into 19th century Russia is that he articulated a very famous quote, which is that the degree of civilization in a society can be judged by entering its prisons. And to move on to the next slide. So prisons and detention settings are very vulnerable to the effects of heat due to overcrowding, often due to outdated prison conditions. And again, not just low-income countries, that's high-income countries as well. The prison estate in the United Kingdom, for example, is still largely Victorian, so it's still largely 19th century buildings. So in carceral settings here, you can see findings suggest association between extreme heat and suicidality. And the image on the right-hand side is of the bottom right is of the United States. So you can see prisons in the US where temperature increases and exposure to extreme heat is deadliest for people. And in the top right in the Northeast, this was a percentage change in deaths in prison between 2001 and 2019 as a result of exposure to extreme heat. So 21% increase of mortality in prisons due to extreme heat. And as we know from the literature, Tina Faisal, for example, at University of Oxford, has done many systematic reviews, many meta-analyses that tell us that prisoners, people living in carceral settings, have a significant psychiatric morbidity rate way above the general population, and very obvious risk factors, some of which I said, like overcrowding, lack of access to support. There are also, to emphasize this idea of heat in prisons, the top image on the right-hand side is of in the Philippines. This is people living who were detained for substance-related crimes during President Duterte's war on drugs that began in 2016, which was a literal war on drugs. So it was extrajudicial killings and mass arrests and mass incarceration, which was stemmed from an authoritarian penal policy, which is a political decision. And this is Philippine men who were, as I say, detained for substance-related crimes, who were lying on a basketball court in Manila with mass overcrowding amidst extremely high temperatures. And many of these people who have been detained have substance use disorders. So again, a political decision has a very local impact on these people. In the United States, there's evidence suggests that people living in prison have been, that prisons have basically been built next to contaminated sites, so environmentally contaminated sites. So again, a population that has a high rate of psychiatric morbidities that are being purposely, because of planning restrictions or because of economic drivers or because of political decisions, exposed to contaminated sites where prison estates are being built. And then the final thing to note is that a lot of prisons around the world are for-profit enterprises, especially in the United States. But there are accounts, for example, in Indonesia, of prison labor being used to engage in ecologically harmful industries like palm oil harvestation. So again, it's just perpetuating the problem, essentially. And it's not just prison scenarios where this is taking place. And again, this isn't limited to forensic mental health. I think we're all going to have to deal with this reality in general psychiatry for inpatient care as well. But this is a paper that was published in 2021 in one of the British Journal of Psychiatry journals, I think BJ Psych Bulletin, by a guy called Jack Tomlin, who's based in London. And he basically looked at all of the things in forensic inpatient services, so through to energy use, food, medicine, psychopharmacological interventions, etc., and suggested that it didn't calculate an exact carbon emission, but there have been studies that have attempted to do this. But psychiatric hospitals, especially forensic settings, have a significant carbon emission. And as the world heats up and we need to keep carbon emissions down, we might have to deal with this reality that the care models are changed by this distal factor, because we can't keep practicing psychiatry, general psychiatry, we can't keep practicing forensic psychiatry in the same way that we've done when the effects of climate change weren't so intensified as they will be in future years. And this might stimulate, obviously, moves to community care, for example. It could stimulate moves to e-medicine more towards artificial intelligence, however it looks like. But it's just raising the point that the effects of climate change might actually affect us as psychiatrists and how we practice psychiatry and how we treat patients and deal with patients, not just in general psychiatry, but in forensic mental health as well. So that's the end of my presentation, nearly, but I just wanted to suggest some things that we can do. And it's been, like I say, a lot of doom and gloom in terms of where we're up to achieving the SDGs. But I would just encourage you all as a call to action. We need to have more research into the causal effects of climate change on mental health. So please do get involved with this area. It's one of the biggest issues that will be facing humanity right now, but also into future decades. And we really need to develop a more robust evidence base on this. We should, as part of that process, we should emphasize qualitative studies more, so allowing people to tell their stories. So it's not just we go into a community that's affected by climate change, we measure prevalence rates and we leave. We need to hear people's stories, so it's bi-directional knowledge exchanges. It's not just going into a community and analysing the data. Ultimately, training might need to change to recognise these emerging determinants, so be it migration, be it conflict, be it climate change. We might need to adapt psychiatric training, which in parts of the world is often the same as it's been done for many decades. And like I say, bi-directional knowledge exchanges, we need to start listening to people who are being affected by these issues, because they may have developed solutions that can be applied elsewhere in the world. So it can't just be, as has tended to be the way, the West telling the rest of the world what to do, but we really have to emphasize bi-directional knowledge exchanges on this. And ultimately, if we're to make change, we need to find our voices. And again, as in the psychiatric discipline, we've not always been the best at advocacy and speaking up for our patients, but at a political level. But I think when vulnerable people are being affected by geopolitical factors, by political decisions, I think we really need to find our voices on this issue. So I'll just close by saying that geopsychiatry, as exemplified by the Sustainable Development Goals and the intersections between number 3, good health and well-being, and the rest of them with all of the geopolitical factors, does emphasize that distal meets local. And we would really encourage you to engage with geopsychiatry as a discipline and to join us in tackling some of the most fundamental problems that are affecting us as a global community, but also as a species, as climate change is. Here's the reference list. And then I would finally just like to say, as a personal anecdote, so this is an image from my apartment in Bern, where I'm very, 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 and I know I'm very, very lucky to live in this beautiful apartment. And I think moving apartment is moving house is like one of the most 3 stressful. I'm not sure if this is based on any data or if it's just on facts.com or something like that. But moving house as an adult is one of the most 3 stressful things that can happen to you as an adult. The other 2 being divorce or death in the family. So we moved apartment a few weeks ago, surrounded by boxes, with my 3-year-old son doing his best to create chaos and noise with the neighbors. And I walked out onto the balcony with all this stress in my head, and I looked out onto the scene, and suddenly I just felt much, much better. So just from a personal perspective, I mean, this is what we've got to lose. This is what we've got to lose. And on the right-hand side, the tree is obscuring it, but you can see the mountain there, which is Jungfrau, which is where that glacier was. We saw the massive recession in the glacier over the last 15 years. So please, let's take action on this, and let's start doing something about this as a community. Thanks very much for listening.
Sorry, thank you very much, Alex, for your very comprehensive and deep thoughts, and also for the emotional input to this global problem. Now let's go to Professor Dinesh Burkha, who's ex-president of the World Psychiatric Association, and will discuss the political determinants of mental health. Dinesh Burkha is professor of psychiatry, served as president of the Royal College of Psychiatrists from 2008 to 2011. He was president of the WPA, as said, from 2014 to 2017, president of the British Medical Association from 2018 to 2019, and currently he is Professor Emeritus of Mental Health and Cultural Diversity at King's College in London. Dinesh, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Kostas, and thanks Afzal and Albert for organizing the session. I'm Alex has said quite a lot of what I was going to say, but what he hasn't said, I'm going to start with that. Because I think one of the major challenges that climate change does not occur in isolation. In the same way that you should not see mental health in isolation from health in general, physical health in particular, but also these are linked with things like education, employment, housing, access to green spaces, access to blue spaces, etc. So what we ought to be doing is looking at climate change in the context of political, commercial, cultural determinants of mental health. So I'm going to focus very much on political determinants, and I'll keep coming back to how these determinants influence climate change. And so I don't want to sort of repeat what do we mean by mental health. It's important for our well-being. It's about good relationships, contributions to community, and the nationhood as a whole. And it's about good thinking and communicating what's going on. So there are three key components of mental disorders or mental illness. And again, mental illness needs to be differentiated from disease. And if we have time, I can come back to that. But it's about changes in thinking, changes in mood, and changes in behavior. And one of the major challenges that we need to think about is that normal or abnormal behavior is very much dictated by cultures. So whatever we see as normal in one culture may not be acceptable or would be seen as abnormal and may be branded mental illness or mental disorder. So we need to be very careful about that. And Alex has talked about social determinants, and we know that social determinants influence mental health. And Alex has also talked about geopolitical determinants, which influence social determinants at national, regional, local, but also at community, personal levels as well. So we've heard about how geopolitical determinants influence humanity directly and indirectly, directly from disasters, conflicts, leading to migration and post-migration, what happens. So people migrate for all kinds of reasons. People can increasingly are migrating as a result of climate change, particularly as has become very clear that in many countries and settings there are floods and or drought and crops are failing, so people have no option but to move for the purposes of survival of themselves, their families, etc. And there is physical impact, poverty, unemployment, poor housing, and we know all of these influence mental health, mental well-being, and our functioning. And living in overcrowded conditions influences us. Emotional impact of those geopolitical determinants, including climate change, that bereavement, survivor guilt, trauma, and we've all been through the pandemic. And certainly today, the first case of Mpox has been reported in the UK. So we don't know what lies ahead. So people who lose family members, they're likely to be bereaved, and particularly if there is survivor guilt, the trauma that Alex has already alluded to, and there are many other potential outcomes. And mental health is affected by climate change, collective violence, famine, floods, and other natural disasters. And political factors such as elections and democratic enfranchisement affects the political dimension of health. And just to remind us that health is political, because health is unequally distributed, even within the same country, even within the same community. And health determinants are dependent on political processes, and health is a crucial human right. And we know that social factors affect, geopolitical factors affect, cultural factors affect our health and well-being, including mental health. And Alex talked about biopsychosocial model, but it's much more complex than that. mental health has biopsychosocial, spiritual, anthropological models of illness that we need to be thinking about and what that means. And geopsychiatry takes into account political, commercial, societal, population, and geographical determinants of mental health. And we know that, I'm not going to sort of repeat that, but social determinants are influenced by political, economic, commercial, cultural, geographical determinants. And there's considerable research evidence now coming not necessarily from psychiatry itself, but also particularly from health economists and geographers, that political systems affect occurrence of psychiatric disorders. They affect resources. Politicians decide who gets detained, who gets treated against their will. So they tell us as clinicians that you have to do this in order to keep society, public safe, or people who may have committed crimes as a result of their psychiatric disorders, and how do we as professionals manage that? So there are very clear direct and indirect influences. And the key political determinants are voting, government, and policies. And Alex alluded to the forthcoming elections next week in the USA and the impact that that will have directly or indirectly around the globe. And it is that the political determinants are very much based on a short-term vision of politicians, because they're forever looking at the next election, next campaign. And in some countries like Australia and New Zealand, it's a 3-year electoral cycle. In USA, it's 4 years. All the members of the Senate is every 6 years. Whereas in the UK, it's, depends upon the prime minister's wishes. So it could be 5 years, it could be 4, it could be 3. So those kind of challenges are really worth remembering. So voting depends upon how the voters feel engaged. The proportion of people who go out to vote, their demographics, and in the latest New Yorker, there's a big, long article about Trump's billionaires, how various billionaires are funding, supporting Republican Party, and so on and so forth. And those political determinants determine the structures of the government. And again, as a local example, in the UK, for example, it was Department of Health and Social Services many years ago. Then it became Department of Health, and then it became Department of Health and something else. Now it's Department of Health and Social Care. So it's all those political decisions determine what's going on, and those policies relate to national security, economic policies, outcomes, etc. And I got first interested in, I've been interested in cultural psychiatry for close on 40 years. But in the late 80s, early 90s, we came across this study from America, which looked at rates of morbid sexual jealousy in 7 countries. And they reported that the rates were very low in communist countries compared with capitalist countries. Now, whether that is still the case, whether the changes with political changes, we don't know. And again, that's a question for some of you to be thinking about, and particularly if you are interested through the International Institute of Geopsychiatry, which is being established in Bern. There are already pre-existing centers of geopsychiatry around the world, in Philippines, in Thailand, in India, in Egypt, in Paraguay, in Brazil. So link up with them for research, policy, and learning materials. And we know that rates of psychiatric disorders in LGBTQ plus populations are higher in countries and states where there is clear discrimination. And when that changes, you bring in equality in law, rates start to drop, rates of depression, anxiety, rates of suicidal ideation, rates of suicide. So those are political determinants. And that indicates that quite often there is very racialized political discourse. Again, in the UK, there was at the last election and before, when a campaign for Brexit was going on, very racialized political discourse came about. It's happening in America as we speak. And this was an interesting study published in JAMA 5 years ago. They found that there was a significant increase in preterm births among Latina women following 2016 presidential elections. And that increase varied between 3.2 and 3.6%. And these were attributed to critical gestation period. So you can see the consequences of that preterm births on children's who are born early and their development and their brain structures and their brain functioning, and the likelihood of women who have preterm birth, how they may develop postnatal depression or psychosis and impact on bringing the child up. So politics, economics, and public policy are important determinants of public health. We know that. And there's considerable research evidence which suggests that social democracy, welfare states, which spend more money on public health, have lower income inequalities, have better self-rated health, as has been shown in Scandinavia. So there are models that we can look at. And this was quite an interesting study, which was published in February this year from James Kirkbride and his group in University College London. So they showed that following various immigration policy changes, which led to Windrush scandal, they compared data before the Immigration Act in 14, after the act, and in 2017, when scandal was being widely discussed in the media, they used GHQ-12, 58,000 plus sample, and people from Black Caribbean backgrounds had worse mental health, and it was worse for non-UK born Black Caribbeans after. So there is a, now you could argue that, is it cause and effect, or is just association? We don't know. We need to kind of work that out. But the fact that policy changes were affecting people's mental health needs to be remembered, that it is important for us as clinicians, so that when we go to see the politicians to advocate for our patients, we can show them the evidence that, look, this is what is happening. So perception of policies may lead to perceived discrimination, and there's considerable evidence, particularly in migrant populations, that it's not the discrimination itself which affects your mental health. It is the perception. If you perceive that you're being discriminated against, it's much worse. And there's interesting work done by health economists Basu and Stuckler and Bamra and others. And Basu and colleagues have shown that private sector health services are not better, they're not more efficient, they're not more accountable or more effective. Now that's something that we need to tease out and think about and compare, particularly as we heard earlier from Albert and from Alex about low and middle income countries, the healthcare systems and what that means. And certainly there is a lot of evidence which suggests that in the NHS, outsourcing of services to for-profit companies does not improve quality of health. So political ideology influences detention of patients, compulsory treatment, as I said earlier. And we know that example exists from Italy when Basaglia reforms led to closure of psychiatric hospitals. That was a political decision recommended by a psychiatrist, but it was a political decision. And so these political determinants allocate resources, structure relationships, administer power and services they create the drivers, including poor environmental conditions, inadequate transportation, unsafe neighborhoods. And all of these, particularly in environmental conditions, influence climate change. And in relation to commercial determinants, and I'll come back to those, the commercial determinants influence how the environment in which people work, environment in which people live, and how they are affected by climate change. And then obviously political determinants allow equitable or inequitable distribution of opportunities and resources. And that in itself, the social and political developments, and the task for us is that we make the politicians, policymakers, stakeholders aware of those socio-political determinants in the long term. And the question that we have to ask our politicians is, what do you want your legacy to be? What do you want to be remembered for? And that we know that political systems influence cultures. There are lots of cultures in transition, particularly in South Asia, where they're moving forward from traditional sociocentric models to much more egocentric models. And we know that egocentric cultures show higher rates of divorce, higher rates of crime, higher rates of psychiatric disorders. So we need to tease out from a research perspective as to what that means. We know that there's a clear data from the USA and the UK looking at the impact of capitalism, particularly neoliberal capitalism, which pushes people into a sense of individualism, income inequality, disempowerment, inadequate social services, outsourcing of jobs, insecurity of jobs, mass incarceration, ineffective healthcare, etc. And because in neoliberal principles, the focus is on commercialization, consumerism, and competitiveness, and we can add climate change to that because all of these C's influence climate change. And it's also about, we know that twice as many people suffer from emotional distress in English-speaking countries which have neoliberal policies compared with countries which do not. Since introduction of neoliberal economic policies in the USA, use of antidepressants has increased, rates of suicide have gone up, rates of anxiety, alcohol, and substance abuse have increased, and anxiety and depression have been shown to be distributed along an economic ingredient. Minority communities show disproportionately higher rates. And again, in that 15-year period, it has been shown that the rates of suicide among Black adolescents have increased by 73%. Life expectancy has fallen in both the USA and the UK. Drug poisoning went up by 44% in the USA, alcohol poisoning by 40%, suicide by 35%, epidemic of opioid misuse, we know. And it also leads to alienation among workers over control of work atmosphere, work organization, work environment. And those commercial determinants, we know that highly processed food is cheaper, full of chemicals, full of additives. And we know that it took 50 years between the first recognition that smoking causes cancer to any action on tobacco control. And as it happened in the West, tobacco companies moved their business more towards low and middle income countries where more and more people are taking on smoking and consequences thereof. And it is quite clear that, because of highly processed foods, nearly 2/3 of adults in the UK and significant proportion in the USA are overweight, obese, which becomes a leading cause of ill health, leading to cancers, diabetes, hypertension, arthritis, cardiovascular disease, etc. But all of those are highly correlated with depression and anxiety. So we need to be thinking about that and how do we deal with that. And commercial determinants basically means that multinational corporations control strategies for manufacture and distribution of products, controlling conditions of manufacture and production, which then leads to political activities. And a lot of these companies are very good at lobbying the politicians, donating to political parties, and to some degree, according to the WHO, misinformation about their products, etc. So using instrumental, structural, and discursive power to undermine public health policies and messages. And young people are particularly at risk of being influenced by advertisement and celebrity promotion. Fast food advertising to youth activates highly sensitive and still developing pathways in teenage brains. Commercial determinants have a very clear impact on climate, and we don't talk about it. Up to 20% of malaria risk in deforestation hotspots is attributable to international trade, pollution and its impact on mental health, unsafe or toxic work environment, and deforestation and antimicrobial resistance, air, soil, and water pollution. These all affect climate and produce that climate change. So we can't see climate change in isolation, and we need to sort of link these things. And we know workers in slaughterhouses and meat packaging, when pushing processed meat products, and these are often located in disadvantaged communities which show higher rates of injury, and at the peak of COVID pandemic experienced high rates of infection from the virus. And commercial determinants influence income levels, educational opportunities, occupation, food insecurity, higher use of tobacco, gender inequity, racial segregation. And these economic determinants also influence mental health. And in addition to poverty, there have been studies where they've shown that farmer suicides in 2020 were more than deaths due to COVID in India. Initiative in Brazil, which led to direct payment to farmers, which led to clear reduction in suicide. But in India, it increased the rates of suicide. So again, we need to be looking at cultural differences and how they impact upon. And we know that as I said earlier, that primary care data from WHO studies showed that rates of psychotic disorders are higher in egocentric countries. So we need to look at cultural variations. Are these due to imposition of Western diagnostic criteria and category fallacy? Are we measuring the right things? And how do these explanatory models and pathways into care are taken into account in terms of understanding? And we know that geographical determinants have shown very clear variation between rural areas and urban areas. But there are a couple of very interesting studies which have shown that personality trait variations, even within the same country, Renfrew and colleagues showed in 2 studies that extroversion is high in some parts of the country, lowest on the East Coast, being agreeable more in the Midwest and not elsewhere. And we need to tease out what's going on. And as I said earlier, that there's quite a lot of evidence which suggests this perception of discrimination, but also rural-urban differences. And this study with 2.4 million subjects looked at frequent mental distress. Now, frequent mental distress is not a psychiatric diagnosis in DSM or in ICD, but what it showed was that the rates varied from 6.9% in Hawaii to 9 point something percent in Kentucky. Overall, in some other parts of the USA, it was as high as 14%. So what's going on? And we need to look at physical determinants which are all going to be affected by climate change, which are going to be affected by commercial determinants, which are going to be affected by other epigenetic factors that we need to be thinking about. And we know that attachment patterns in childhood influence brain structures and functioning. And we know that social determinants produce intergenerational difficulties. And there's increasing evidence coming from studies in India showing that there are very clear differences in rates and expectations. And there have been series of studies which have shown that attachment patterns in childhood affect brain structures, which then go on to affect brain functioning, social, cognitive, and emotional functioning. So we need to be thinking, how do we make sense of these attachment patterns and how these are affected by external factors? So if, child is born in poverty, there's inadequate nutrition, or as a result of conflict or disasters, you're moving from one area to another, what does that do to your attachment patterns, to your brain structures, and to your brain functioning? So those social interactions are incredibly important. And that personal interaction plays a major role. So just to kind of draw things to a conclusion, that psychiatric disorders use different dimensions, different perspectives, whether we use a disease versus illness perspective, use a dimensional perspective on a spectrum of disorders, lifestyle perspective, or behavioral perspectives. These are all related to social functioning, which are influenced by factors like commercial determinants, political determinants, but also cultural, economic, and geographical determinants. And we know disease is a clinical entity and is a pathology, but the way disease influences patients' functioning turns it into illness, and we need to start looking at illness experiences, moving away from disease, focusing on very much biopsychosocial, cultural, spiritual, anthropological dimensions. And in the same way, as I said earlier, that we need to look at climate change not in isolation, but linked with all those factors. We also need to look at policies in education, employment, social care, housing, criminal justice, poverty alleviation, and social security, to look at community development, immigration, and beyond. So once again, my thanks to Afzal and Albert for organizing the session, and Kostas in particular for taking the time out to sort out the basic principles, and to Alex to set the scene so effectively. Thank you all very much.
So thank you, Dinesh, for the excellent presentation. Now we have time. I would like to welcome Tarek Okasha, a very prominent person from the WPA. Hello, Tarek, welcome with us. So we have time for questions, and of course discussion between us. I don't see any questions from the audience. Maybe Tarek, you want to make a comment?
Yes, I just wanted to make a comment. Thank you, first of all, Kostas, for your chairmanship, and I'd like to thank Albert and Afzal for their input, and thank you to Alex and Dinesh for very interesting presentations. Egypt is geographically located in a very special place at the moment, what's happening in the world. So in Egypt, for example, we have 10 million refugees, mainly from Sudan, mainly from Ethiopia, Palestine, Yemen, Libya, Syria, Iraq. And in Egypt, we don't have any camps or any places for people who are refugees. They live within the population itself. And these 10 million people are causing approximately an economic burden of $1 billion because they are living within the society. We have subsidies for fuel, subsidies for wheat and things like this. So they are living within with the people in Egypt. So this is something else that's important to be addressed. Also, the people coming from Sudan, as Dinesh mentioned, there are a lot of things that are occurring, especially with psychiatric disorders. We have a lot of patients now that we're even seeing in Cairo in the university hospitals, not on the border in Aswan, Upper Egypt, where patients are coming from Sudan suffering from tuberculosis, suffering from malaria. We're seeing a lot of viral encephalitis presenting with acute psychotic episodes. So even the presentation and the morphology of the symptomatology that the patients are coming with is different. We have to be very aware about doing lumbar punctures, things that we usually did not do with our patients that used to come. So it's changing a lot of things, and there is also a problem of cholera that is occurring at the border in Sudan. So all these aspects have to be taken in place. And as we heard from Alex, what's happening in Ukraine, the same is happening in Gaza. I know that all the mental health facilities have been bombed, and a lot of mental health workers, psychiatrists, psychologists, psychiatric nurses have passed away. So all these factors are affecting our area. And as I talked before with Albert and Dinesh and Afzal, that sometimes we tend to concentrate more on problems that are occurring in Europe and South America and Southeast Asia, but we forget Northern Africa, and we even forget more Sub-Saharan Africa, which have a lot of problems, especially if you're going to talk about climate and things. All the animals, all the plants, all the forests that are Sub-Saharan Africa, which are being lost like the glaciers in Switzerland and so on. So I just like to emphasize that we need to look also at the continent of Africa and the Middle East, like we're looking to Europe and South America and Southeast Asia. Thank you, Kostas, for the time.
Thanks very much, Tarek. You're absolutely right that there are challenges. And one of the fascinating things that, Albert led on and found was that the number of refugees are much higher in low and middle income countries rather than high income countries. And they are bearing most of the burden, if we can call it that. Yet the biggest noise comes from high income countries.
Well, we can say that the whole planet is in a turmoil, in an accelerated turmoil. We can call it a transformation of some kind. Transformation in many levels. It's climate transformation, it's economic transformation, it's population transformation in terms of age. Average age is increasing. The average size of families is decreasing. So the urbanization is skyrocketing. Is urbanization, in my opinion, urbanization is the highest challenge in terms of how it transforms society and affects mental health. So, Afzal, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, thank you, Kostas, and thanks to both speakers for raising very important issues that are going to affect and matter in the mental health areas. My question and a comment is from asking both the speakers as well as Albert, that while we are now getting more insight about all these determinants, whether it is cultural, social, political, economical, physical health, as Dinesh has mentioned, are we ready to train our future mental health professionals in these areas? Because this is something which is putting a big responsibility on us. So, I mean, any suggestions, especially for low-income countries, that how can we include and put this particular topic into the curriculum for undergraduate as well as postgraduate medical students, psychology students, anthropology students, I mean the social sciences.
Thank you very much, Afzal, if I may respond. I mean, I think in some ways, these things are not new. We're just kind of bringing them together. I mean, in the UK, for example, the Black report, which looked at social determinants, is over 50 years old. So it's only sort of, Michael Marmot's work kind of took it to another level. So these things happen, but the question is, how do we highlight it to the powers that be that, there needs to be a change. And one of the major advantages in South Asia, Southeast Asia, particularly in the subcontinent, is that in medical school, I think we still have preventive and social medicine. And therefore, I recall and talking to students, recent students, that there's no mention of mental health in preventive and social medicine. It's all about infections. And one of the challenges that we have is to highlight to the deans and educationalists that you may be focusing on infection control, but infection has psychological, psychiatric consequences, and how do we deal with that? So we need to make sure that should be a fairly easy sell, because the syllabus is already there and they're doing something, and how do we kind of convince them to look at mental health? And perhaps, and that this is a very personal view, is that we need to move back to including physical and mental health as part of health, and mental health is not something separate in a Cartesian mind-body dualism, that mind doesn't talk to body. Those kind of models exist, particularly in low and middle income countries, and just the question of how we bring them into mainstream, really.
Yes, just to reiterate the point that Afzal was making regards how do we get the geopsychiatry education into the curriculum. We are about to publish a geopsychiatry study that throws out lots of interesting facts. What we found is that those countries that is at the forefront of these multiple geopolitical challenges, the young doctors and other clinicians there are more or less starting to accept that they need this geopsychiatry model education into their curriculum, whether through e-learning, certificate program, diploma, master's, PhD, it's all emerging. But the countries where maybe who we might call richer, high-income countries, they're still stepping back and sticking to their models of, social determinants of health and developing their education towards that. And as Dinesh said, there's lots of examples of education models from low-income countries, some in the Caribbean, some in India, even some in Africa, that we can learn from how these countries have adapted, particularly through the pandemic years with Ebola, COVID, and now Mpox, how they're responding to that, and the various public health or the disasters, earthquakes, and how they responded to that. So I think there's a lot to be learned from the other side, so that the global north into the west. And I think the tactics will be how we capture that and bring it into future educational plans. That paper will be published soon, and you will see more of it to come.
So I think we covered the general idea, the general topic. I would ask Afzal to say a couple of words to conclude, and then Albert to conclude the works of the workshop. Afzal.
I think,
Okay.
as we are just having time, sorry, it could be my internet connection, but probably Albert will be in a better position to summarize and conclude.
Okay, Albert.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to conclude. I mean, in the last hour and a half, we've heard a tapestry of what is going on around the world that affects, what happens in one part of the world affects us in our part of the world as individuals, as communities, and whatever. At the beginning of this talk, I talked about we don't want to create an inventory of of what's happening. We want to do something about it. And I mentioned research policy and practice. And I hope the two presentations showed you that we try to understand what we're faced with globally, and from Dinesh's point of view, what we're trying to do to address it. But in the words of Mia Mottley is the Prime Minister of Barbados, small island, like many other small islands, and Tariq rightly mentioned the MENA regions. Small islands, we don't talk a lot about them, but she represents a small island. And when she said, the problem is here, we have to do something about it. We cannot look the other way. And I want to conclude by saying that to make progress against all these challenges, we need to understand what's going on around us. How the people we're looking after, how communities or friends or families, and then respond. Dinesh mentioned the various centers for geopsychiatry around the world. We're going to set up more. The International Institute of Geopsychiatry in Bern will be fully established soon. That'll become the reservoir. And in concluding, rather than parrot what everybody has said, I want to say to you and make an appeal to say, join us in this journey. Be at the forefront, because climate change, conflict is not going away tomorrow. Hunger, poverty, global austerity is not going away. In mental health, let's lead this. And the people who are involved in geopsychiatry is taking that leadership. We will have a new webinar, I think, going to be led from India, because we're sharing it around the world. So more details will come. If you want to have more information, a lot is on our geopsychiatry website. And do email us and contact us, or any one of the speakers are here. So on behalf of everyone, I'd like to thank you all and to look forward for more things to come. Thank you, Kostas. Dinesh?
Take care. Bye-bye. Thank you all for being with us.
Thank you.
Until next time, of course. Take care. Bye-bye.